In the vast reaches of the galaxy, where hundreds of planets and species thrived in a cosmic dance of civilization and chaos, there was one truth that stood above all others: survival was a game played by the strong, the cunning, and the ruthless. The universe was full of many wonders, but it also hid its darkest secrets beneath the shimmering stars and endless stretches of space. On the bustling trade routes, where every corner held a story and every ship whispered rumors, one story stood out, one that began with a heart-wrenching betrayal. It was a day like any other when the young alien girl, no older than a human teenager, found herself standing on the cold metal floors of a galactic auction house. Her green skin, speckled with shimmering blue patterns, marked her as a member of a rare and beautiful species, one known for their ability to manipulate energy with their minds, a gift that many across the galaxy coveted. But for her, that gift had become a curse. She had been sold. Not just to the highest bidder, but by her own family. Her kin, who once taught her to harness her powers, had turned their backs on her, casting her into a cruel world where her very existence was reduced to a commodity. They had sold her to the highest bidder, hoping to secure their own survival in a galaxy where even the strongest were not always safe. The alien girl had known pain before, but the sting of abandonment by those who should have cared for her most was a wound that cut deeper than any she'd ever known. As the bidding started, her eyes, a deep shade of violet, flickered with desperation. She tried not to show the fear bubbling inside, the terror of what awaited her once she was claimed by one of these cold-hearted traders. Yet, despite her best efforts to remain stoic, she couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that her life was slipping through her fingers like sand. Every passing second felt like an eternity, the faces of the bidders around her a blur of greed and indifference. But just as the auctioneer's voice echoed through the hall, something shifted in the air. A figure stood at the back, tall and unassuming, with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the crowd. He had the look of someone who didn't belong, out of place amidst the lavish surroundings of the auction house, yet somehow too determined to be ignored. His eyes locked on hers for a brief moment, and for the first time since this nightmare began, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. The man wasn't like the others. There was no greed in his eyes, no desire for power or control. No, in his eyes she saw something that was almost foreign in this world: compassion. It was a rare thing in the galaxy. But it was there, clear as day. And in that fleeting moment, she wondered, could this stranger be her salvation? Or was he just another part of the endless machinery that governed this brutal universe? The auctioneer's gavel came down, the sound like thunder in the quiet room. The deal was struck, and the alien girl was no longer the property of her family, but now, she was someone else's possession. The weight of the moment crashed down on her, and she prepared herself for whatever new horrors awaited. But just as she was about to be led away, the stranger stepped forward, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I'll take her." A murmur of surprise rippled through the room, and the bidders turned to look at him, shocked at the audacity of his words. But it wasn't the words themselves that made the situation strange, it was the manner in which they were spoken. Calm, confident, almost as if he were reclaiming something that was never meant to be lost in the first place. The auctioneer hesitated. He had grown accustomed to the way things worked here: everything had its price. But this man, with his steady, unwavering presence, seemed to challenge that simple rule. There was no room for hesitation in this place, money ruled all. Yet there was something about the way the man spoke that made it impossible for anyone to argue. And so, the terms were set. The alien girl's fate was no longer tied to the hands of those who sought to profit from her. Instead, it was in the hands of someone who, it seemed, saw her as more than just a prize to be won. But who was this man? What was his story, and why did he act with such certainty in a galaxy that had long since forgotten the meaning of kindness? His motives remained unclear, but the alien girl, despite herself, felt a flicker of gratitude toward him, a feeling she had long since buried beneath layers of fear and resentment. She had been discarded, used, and betrayed, But now, this man was offering her something that felt almost impossible, a chance. But with this newfound opportunity came uncertainty. She had no idea where this stranger was taking her, what his true intentions were, or even if she could trust him. She had been wrong before. How could she be sure that this wasn't just another game, another trick of fate? Her heart beat faster as they made their way through the halls, past the darkened corners and into the unknown. The journey ahead was uncertain, but the truth was undeniable: she had been given a chance. And now, for the first time in what felt like forever, she had to choose. Would she trust this human, this stranger who had shown her a kindness she hadn't expected? Or would she continue to live in the shadows, forever a prisoner of her past? As they walked away from the auction house and into the dimming light of the galaxy's unknown reaches, the alien girl couldn't shake the feeling that something far larger than just her fate was unfolding. She could feel it in the air, the unspoken tension that surrounded them both. She had been sold by her own family, but now, her path was in the hands of someone else. The universe was full of mysteries, but this one was personal. And as the stars stretched above them, she couldn't help but wonder what would happen next. Would this human truly become her savior, or was he just another part of the ever-expanding web of betrayal and deceit that had trapped her for so long? Only time would tell. But as the two of them disappeared into the vastness of space, one thing was certain: this story was far from over. And what came next would change everything. The cold, metallic walls of the corridor echoed as the man led her down an unmarked path. Her bare feet barely made a sound as she walked beside him, the soft hum of machinery around them almost drowned out by the heavy thoughts racing through her mind. She hadn't spoken a word since he had claimed her at the auction, nor had he. The silence between them was thick, laden with unspoken questions. The weight of the moment was pressing down on her chest like a heavy stone. She couldn't stop herself from glancing at him, trying to make sense of the man who had appeared out of nowhere, and yet seemed so certain of what he was doing. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark, close-cropped hair and eyes that had once seemed kind, but now appeared distant, as though they were carrying the burden of something far more complicated than the simple act of rescuing a captive. His face was set in a way that suggested deep thought, as if he was piecing together a puzzle that no one else could see. His presence was calm, almost too calm, in contrast to the chaotic auction house they had just left behind. He didn't seem like the kind of man who would be caught up in the affairs of such a grim place. But what kind of man was he, really? And why had he chosen her? She had heard of humans before. How could she not? Their species was scattered all across the galaxy, known for their adaptability, their resourcefulness, and their resilience. But they were also feared for their potential to conquer, to rise to the top by any means necessary. In a galaxy full of ruthless beings, humans were a wild card. They weren't bound by the same traditions, the same rigid rules of the older, more established species. And that unpredictability made them both dangerous and fascinating. But this man, he didn't feel dangerous. Not to her, at least. And yet, she couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her stomach. What did he want with her? Why take such a risk when the auction house was filled with other bidders who could have taken her off his hands in an instant? There had to be more to his actions than simple kindness. Her mind wandered back to the auction house. Her family. The faces of her relatives flashed in her thoughts, their cold, calculating gazes as they had stood in front of her, discussing the sale of their own flesh and blood. How had they come to this? How could they have sold her, cast her aside as if she were no more valuable than an object to be discarded once it had outlived its use? The betrayal had stung, cutting deeper than she cared to admit. It was a wound she wasn't sure she could heal. And yet here she was, with a stranger who had intervened without hesitation. The dissonance between her family's betrayal and this man's apparent willingness to help her was too great to ignore. It didn't make sense. There had to be something more to it. As they walked further down the hall, the man came to a sudden stop in front of a doorway. The door slid open silently, revealing a small, windowless room lit by a soft blue light. It was sterile, almost clinical, the kind of room where someone would be kept for observation. A sense of foreboding filled the air as she stepped inside. "Sit," the man said quietly, gesturing toward a simple chair in the center of the room. His voice was low but firm, like someone accustomed to issuing orders. He didn't sound like someone to be questioned, but there was no malice in his tone. He wasn't threatening her, at least, not directly. She hesitated for a moment, unsure whether she should obey or resist. She wanted to speak, to demand answers, but the words seemed to stick in her throat. So, instead, she sat in the chair, her back straight and her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her heart racing with a mixture of confusion and fear. She couldn't shake the nagging thought that something was wrong, that the answers she sought were just beyond her reach, hidden in the layers of this mysterious man's story. The man didn't sit across from her. Instead, he walked toward a nearby console, tapping a few buttons with a practiced motion. The hum of machinery filled the room again, and she could feel the air shift, the weight of his presence settling around her. He wasn't speaking, but she could tell he was deep in thought, his eyes scanning the data on the screen in front of him. She had no idea what it meant, but the way he was looking at the information made her stomach tighten. "What are you looking for?" she asked quietly, unable to stay silent any longer. He paused, glancing over his shoulder, but didn't answer right away. His lips parted, as if he was considering how much to reveal. "Answers," he said finally, his voice quiet but firm. "Answers? What answers?" Her heart skipped a beat as she thought about what those words could mean. Was he after something more than just her freedom? Could this man have been tracking her down, seeking her out for reasons beyond just pity or compassion? The idea seemed almost absurd, but then again, nothing about the galaxy made sense these days. She had learned the hard way that no one was ever as simple as they appeared. Before she could ask anything else, the door behind her opened, and 2 guards entered, their uniforms marking them as part of the ship's security crew. The man turned toward them without a word, his demeanor still calm, but there was an edge to his stance now. The guards saluted him, then stood at attention, waiting for orders. "Make sure no one enters or leaves this room without my say-so," the man instructed them, his voice leaving no room for argument. The guards nodded and positioned themselves outside the door, their eyes fixed on the hallway beyond. The air in the room grew even heavier. The tension between the man and the girl was palpable, as if something was building, something neither of them could name yet. The man returned to the console, and for a moment, the alien girl sat there in silence, the quiet buzzing of the machinery filling the space between them. What was happening? What was he planning? Was this just a temporary safe house, or was there something more to the situation than she understood? Her thoughts were interrupted when he suddenly turned toward her, his expression unreadable. "You were sold by your family," he said, as though stating a simple fact. "What happened to you wasn't your fault. I want you to understand that." Her breath caught in her throat. How did he know? She hadn't told him anything about her past, about what had led her to the auction house. She hadn't even spoken about the betrayal, yet here he was, acknowledging it as if he knew it all along. "Why?" she whispered, unable to stop herself. "Why would you do this? Rescue me?" He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze locked on hers, and for a long moment, she could see the conflict in his eyes. It was like he was weighing something that might change everything. "I don't know yet," he said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I think you'll find that your story is just beginning. And I'll be there to make sure it doesn't end like this." The words hung in the air like a promise, but it was a promise she wasn't sure she could trust. She was caught between gratitude and suspicion, her mind spinning in a whirlwind of confusion and uncertainty. For now, all she knew was that she had been given a chance she couldn't afford to waste. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the man who had saved her from the auction house had his own secrets, and that the path ahead would be far more dangerous than she could ever imagine. The days that followed felt like a blur. Each one was a mix of uncertainty and strange tension. The man, whose name she still didn't know, kept to himself mostly, rarely speaking more than necessary. He was always nearby, but never too close. He had given her the space to settle, though she never truly felt at ease. The sterile walls of the room felt suffocating at times, the air thick with unasked questions and lingering fears. What was he waiting for? What did he want from her, and why had he gone so far to save her? She had tried to pry some answers from him, but he only ever gave her vague responses, not enough to ease the unease gnawing at her. When he wasn't busy with the ship's controls or working on something she didn't understand, he seemed to retreat into his own thoughts, his expression distant, as though battling something within himself. His silence was maddening. Was he really here to protect her, or was there something else going on? Every interaction, every fleeting glance, only made her feel like a pawn in a game she didn't yet comprehend. She had learned little about the ship they were on. She had no idea where they were going or why the man had taken her to this place. The ship itself felt isolated, far removed from the bustling life of the trade routes. There was a sense of remoteness to it, as if they were traveling into the unknown, deliberately avoiding attention. The ship was sleek and efficient, designed for speed and stealth. But there was something off about it, something in the way the man acted, as though he were always on edge, waiting for something. It unsettled her, even more than the mystery of her situation already had. One evening, the door to her room slid open. She had been sitting by the small window, staring out into the endless void of space, lost in her own thoughts, when the man stepped inside. This time, however, there was a different energy about him, a subtle shift in his demeanor that made her feel on alert. He was more tense than usual, his movements sharper, more purposeful. There was a glint in his eyes she hadn't seen before, something dangerous, something she couldn't ignore. "Come with me," he said abruptly, his voice low, urgent. She stood immediately, though she felt a twinge of hesitation. There was no warmth in his tone now, only command. It sent a chill down her spine. "Where are we going?" "To the control room," he replied, his gaze flicking toward the door. "Something's happening." That wasn't an answer, but she didn't argue. He turned and walked out of the room, and she followed quickly, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and curiosity. As they made their way down the narrow corridors, she couldn't help but notice how much quieter the ship seemed than usual. There was no hum of activity, no chatter from the crew. It felt empty. It felt like they were alone. The control room was just ahead, and when they entered, her breath caught in her throat. The lights inside were dim, casting long shadows across the room. The man was already at the main console, his hands flying over the controls with practiced precision. But what caught her attention wasn't what he was doing, it was what he was looking at. A series of blinking red alerts filled the large screen in front of him. Her eyes widened as she read the words flashing across the screen: "Hostile entity detected." The man cursed under his breath, his fingers moving faster. The air in the room seemed to crackle with tension. "It's them," he muttered to himself. "They've found us." Her mind raced. Who? Who had found them? The man hadn't been clear about his past, but this sudden panic, the urgency in his every movement, told her that something dangerous was closing in on them. Something that could change everything. "Who are they?" she asked, trying to steady her voice, but the words came out sharper than she intended. The man didn't respond immediately, his attention fixed on the screen. His jaw was clenched, his brow furrowed with a focus she hadn't seen from him before. The quiet hum of the ship's engines seemed to grow louder, as though they were echoing the rising tension in the room. "They're from my past," he said at last, his voice tight. "People I've been running from for a long time. And they've finally caught up to me." A shiver ran through her as the reality of the situation sank in. Whatever had brought her to this point, Whatever had led her into the hands of this stranger had just escalated into something far more dangerous. She wasn't just a captive anymore. She was a target. Before she could ask any more questions, the ship lurched. The floor beneath them shuddered as a blast of energy hit the hull. The man's hands slammed against the console, his face contorted in a mixture of anger and fear. "Shields are failing," he said, more to himself than to her. A loud, metallic screech echoed through the ship, followed by the sound of alarms blaring. The lights flickered, casting long, erratic shadows across the room. The man cursed again and began typing furiously, his actions a blur as he tried to regain control. She could hear the pounding of footsteps outside the room, now heavily booted feet, moving with purpose. There was no mistaking it now, they were under attack. "Get to the escape pods," the man ordered, his voice strained. "Now." She froze for a moment, the reality of what he was asking her to do sinking in. "Escape pods? You're leaving?" He didn't look at her. "I'm staying." "You need to go." She couldn't believe what she was hearing. She had trusted him, had followed him without question, but now he was telling her to leave him behind? She took a step toward him, confusion and anger rising within her. "Why? You brought me here. You promised me safety. Why are you abandoning me?" His eyes finally met hers, and for the first time since she had met him, she saw the full weight of his burden in those eyes. "Because it's not just you they want," he said, his voice hoarse. "They want me. And if I go down, I'll make sure you get away. You can't be caught up in this." She shook her head, a sense of panic rising in her chest. "I'm not leaving you." But before she could say anything more, the ship jolted again, harder this time. The lights flickered once more, and the sound of heavy explosions echoed through the hull. He grabbed her by the arm, his grip surprisingly strong, and began pulling her toward the door. "You don't have a choice," he shouted. "Get to the pod, now!" She stumbled, her mind racing with 1,000 thoughts, none of them making sense. But before she could protest again, another explosion shook the ship, sending them both crashing to the floor. She gasped as the pain shot through her side, but before she could recover, the man was already up, dragging her to her feet. "This is your only chance," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. She met his gaze, seeing the raw fear there, fear not for himself, but for her. And in that moment, everything changed. The man who had saved her, who had shown her a kindness she hadn't known in years, was not just a stranger. He was someone who had been running from the same darkness that had consumed her own life. And now, they were both caught in its grip. With a final, desperate glance at him, she turned and ran down the corridor, the sound of explosions and the heavy pounding of boots echoing behind her. She had no idea what was waiting for her at the escape pods, but she knew one thing for certain: her life, and his, depended on how she played this game. Her breath came in ragged gasps as she sprinted down the narrow corridor, her heart pounding in her chest. The ship groaned around her, the sound of explosions growing louder with each passing second. Every footstep echoed in the halls, sending a shiver of dread through her. She had no idea how far she was from the escape pods, but she knew she had to keep moving. The urgency of the situation was undeniable. There was no time to think, only to act. She turned a corner, almost losing her balance as the ship jolted violently once more, the entire structure shuddering with the force of the blast. The lights flickered, casting eerie shadows that made every movement feel like it was being watched. Fear surged within her. She had to make it to the pods. She couldn't leave the man behind, but the odds of making it out alive were growing slimmer by the second. But as she rounded another corner, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking her path. She skidded to a halt, her instincts screaming that something was wrong. The figure was tall, cloaked in a dark uniform that looked familiar, too familiar. It was one of the guards from the auction house. The realization hit her like a slap to the face. How did they find me? The man standing in front of her smirked, his hand resting casually on the weapon strapped to his side. Going somewhere? He asked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. I'm afraid you won't be getting away that easily. Her mind raced. She had thought the threat was over when they had escaped the auction house, but this was a new level of danger. The auction house had only been the beginning. Whoever had been behind it was now closing in on her, and she was running straight into their trap. Why? She demanded, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and anger. Why are you doing this? I thought I was free. The guard's smirk widened, and he stepped forward slowly, his boots thudding against the floor. You were never free, he said, his eyes glinting with something darker than malice. You're a commodity. A valuable one. You belong to someone much more important than you realize. Before she could react, the sound of more footsteps echoed from the corridor behind her. A group of figures appeared, their silhouettes barely visible in the dim light. She had been so focused on the guard in front of her that she hadn't noticed them closing in from behind. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. She was surrounded. Her pulse spiked. She had to act fast, but every option seemed to lead to an even worse outcome. The guards were closing in from every angle. She was trapped, and the man she had trusted had fought for was nowhere to be seen. She was alone. But then, something strange happened. The man who had saved her appeared behind the group of guards, emerging from the shadows with a cold, determined expression. He moved with a fluidity that was almost unnatural, his eyes locked onto the guard in front of her. Without a word, he lunged forward, his hands a blur of motion. In a split second, the guard who had been blocking her path was on the ground, incapacitated by a swift strike. For a moment, she stood there, frozen in shock. Was this the same man who had told her to run? The man who had ordered her to leave? He was fighting, risking his life to protect her. The realization hit her harder than the explosion that had rocked the ship just minutes before. There was more to him than she had ever known. But the fight wasn't over. The remaining guards reacted quickly, drawing their weapons, and the tension in the air became almost unbearable. The man didn't hesitate. He moved like a force of nature, striking with precision and speed. Yet, for every guard he took down, two more seemed to appear from the shadows. The odds were quickly stacking up against him. He couldn't keep this up forever. Go! He shouted, his voice sharp and commanding as he turned to her. Get to the pods, now! For a moment, she hesitated. Her instincts screamed at her to stay and help, but the odds were against them. He was fighting a losing battle, and the only way she could survive was to do as he said. She couldn't stay here. If she did, they would both die. She had to escape. But as she turned to run, a loud crack echoed through the corridor, and a searing pain shot through her side. She stumbled, gasping for air as her body slammed against the cold metal wall. Blood trickled down her side, staining her clothes. Her vision blurred, but she forced herself to stay on her feet. No, no, no. She couldn't stop now. Her heart was pounding, but she couldn't feel the pain. The world around her seemed to slow as she pushed through the agony, her body moving on sheer willpower. She had to get to the pods. She had to escape. She didn't see the figure until it was too late. A sharp, piercing pain ripped through her chest, and she gasped, her knees buckling beneath her as her body went numb. The world spun as she collapsed onto the cold, unforgiving floor. Her vision blurred, and everything seemed distant, as if she were floating above the chaos. She could hear the man's voice, but it sounded like it was coming from miles away. He was shouting something, ordering her to get up, to keep fighting, to survive. But it didn't matter. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. And then, in the midst of the chaos, everything stopped. The explosions, the sounds of gunfire, the screams, all of it faded into silence. The only thing left was the pain, the cold, and the dark. But even as the darkness began to take her, she caught a glimpse of something in the distance. A ship. Not one of the escape pods, but a massive, imposing vessel, moving toward them with terrifying speed. The insignia on its side was unmistakable. It was the same symbol she had seen before, the one that had been burned into her memory since the day of the auction. The symbol of the people who had sold her. The ones who wanted her back. The stakes had just been raised. The fight for her life wasn't over. It had only just begun. The blackness pressed in around her, cold and unyielding. The pain in her chest had dulled to a deep ache, and her limbs felt heavy, like they no longer belonged to her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, each one harder to draw. She was sinking, spiraling into the darkness, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. But then, like a distant echo, she heard his voice. "Get up." It was raw, desperate, cutting through the silence like a lifeline. She wanted to ignore it. She wanted to let go. But his words pulled at something deep inside her, something she couldn't name, something that kept her tethered to the world, to the fight. She forced her eyes open, the world swimming in front of her, everything blurry and out of focus. She saw the man, his face twisted in anguish as he knelt beside her, his hands trembling as he tried to help her sit up. "You're not dying here," he said, his voice barely more than a whisper, as if the words themselves were a fight to speak. Her heart stuttered. She could feel the blood draining from her body, but there was something in his gaze, something in the way he looked at her, that made her believe him. Not here. Not like this. Summoning every last ounce of strength, she grabbed his arm, using him as leverage to push herself upright. The pain flared again, sharp and unbearable, but she gritted her teeth and forced it down. Her head was spinning, her body betraying her, but she couldn't stop. She couldn't afford to stop. The ship groaned beneath them again, a tremor of violence shaking the walls. The lights above flickered and died, casting the hall into an eerie, stuttering darkness. She heard the thudding footsteps of the guards drawing closer, and panic spiked in her chest. "We have to move," she whispered, her voice hoarse. She could barely stand, but she had no choice. They had to escape. He nodded, his face grim, and together they stumbled forward, his arms supporting her as they made their way down the corridor. Every step felt like a battle. Every breath felt like a struggle. The world was falling apart around them, but she clung to the one certainty she had left, the man beside her. As they turned a corner, they finally reached the escape pod bay. The sight of the pods brought a sense of fleeting hope. They were close now. Just a few more steps, and they could make it out. But as they moved to one of the pods, something in the air shifted. The hairs on the back of her neck stood on end. She looked up, eyes wide, and saw it a ship, massive and looming, dark against the starry void. The symbol she had seen earlier, the same one that had haunted her thoughts since her capture, was emblazoned on its side. The ship wasn't just closing in, it was already here, hovering just above the wreckage of the ship they were on. Her blood ran cold. It was them. The people who had sold her. The ones who had orchestrated her entire nightmare. "Get in the pod, now!" The man barked, his tone harsh, but there was something else in it too: urgency, panic. The same fear that had gripped him earlier was back in his eyes, and she realized it wasn't just about her anymore. Whatever had brought them together, whatever mission he was on, it was personal now. But as she took a step toward the pod, the blast doors at the entrance to the base slammed down, trapping them inside. The air seemed to freeze around them. She turned to the man, her chest tightening. "What's happening?" His eyes darted around the room, his fingers brushing against the control panel of the nearest pod. "They've sealed us in. They're coming for us." Before she could say anything else, the doors on the far side of the bay creaked open, and a group of heavily armed soldiers marched in, their presence as commanding as it was terrifying. Leading them was a figure she recognized, a tall, imposing man with piercing eyes and a cold smile. The same one who had been at the auction, the one who had sold her like a piece of property. "Did you really think you could escape?" he sneered, his voice cold as ice. "I always knew you'd try something foolish." The man beside her stiffened, his jaw clenched. She could see the conflict in his eyes, but there was something else there too, resignation. It hit her then. This wasn't just about her. This was his fight too. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice breaking the silence. The man who had been leading the guards smiled again, a smile that was more a threat than anything else. "You belong to me, girl. And I intend to make sure you know your place." She stepped forward, her fists clenched. "I'm not anyone's property," she said, her voice steady despite the fear that threatened to overtake her. "I'm not going back." The man's smile faltered for just a second, but he quickly regained his composure. He gestured for the guards to move forward, and they stepped toward her with cold, calculated precision. Before she could react, the man beside her moved, his body a blur of motion. He pushed her toward the escape pod, knocking her to the floor inside it. "Go!" he shouted, his voice urgent. She looked up at him, eyes wide with panic. "What are you doing?" "I'm staying," he said, his voice fierce. "I'll hold them off." "You get out of here." Her mind screamed at her to do as he said, but she couldn't leave him behind, not after everything. "I'm not going without you," she yelled, her voice cracking. But before she could protest further, he slammed the pod's hatch shut, locking her inside. She pounded on the door, her heart racing, but it was no use. He was already moving toward the guards, the determined look on his face setting like stone. "Go!" he shouted, his voice muffled by the thick metal. "Now!" Her body screamed for her to stay, to fight, to do something. But there was no time. There was no other choice. With a final, agonized glance at the man she had come to trust, the escape pod shot away from the ship, hurtling into the unknown void. The world outside the pod was a blur of stars and darkness, but her mind was locked on the image of the man fighting against impossible odds, holding them off for her. She could hear the echoes of the battle over the radio, but it didn't matter. She was gone. Just as she thought the worst was over, the pod's sensors blinked on, a new message flashing across the screen in bold red letters. "Incoming ship detected. Hostile vessel locking on." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. She wasn't free yet. The fight was far from over. And in that moment, everything changed. The man hadn't just been fighting to protect her, he had been fighting for something much bigger than either of them could have imagined. The real battle had just begun, and she was already in the thick of it. The pod shook violently as it hurtled through space, a sense of cold dread settling deep in her stomach. The blinking message on the screen had left her paralyzed with fear. The hostile vessel locking on to her escape pod. She had barely made it out of the chaos, but now the worst was still to come. The pod's warning systems blared, but there was nothing she could do. She was too far from any known station, too far from safety. Her fingers hovered over the control panel. She knew she could try to turn the pod around, attempt to evade the hostile ship, but it was a futile hope. The pod wasn't designed for battle, and no matter how much she wanted to take control of her own fate, she was powerless. It felt like she was being drawn into a cosmic web, where every choice led her deeper into the darkness. "Focus," she muttered to herself, forcing her mind to settle. She could feel the panic creeping up her spine, but she had no choice now but to think clearly. The man who had fought so hard to protect her had known this moment would come. Had he anticipated it all along? Was this part of the plan? Questions swirled in her mind, but there was no time to answer them. She needed a way out. As the hostile ship approached, its dark silhouette looming ever larger in the viewfinder, Her thoughts raced back to everything that had led her here, everything that had brought her to this moment in the vast expanse of space. She remembered the auction, the fear, the anger that had gripped her heart. She had been sold, traded as though her life had no meaning, no value beyond what her captors had seen in her. But it was more than just the auction. She thought of the man, how he had risked everything to help her escape, how he had protected her even when he didn't know her. He was more than a savior. He was a symbol of something greater, something she didn't fully understand but had begun to grasp over the course of their flight. He had given her hope, and now she had to honor that hope, even if it meant facing impossible odds. But she couldn't ignore the reality of the situation. The hostile ship was closing in too quickly. It had to be a warship, far too advanced for her to escape alone. She would have to rely on her wits, her instincts, and perhaps something deeper, something she hadn't yet realized about herself. With no other option, she initiated the emergency escape protocols. The pod's lights flickered as the emergency system powered up, shifting the pod's trajectory. She wasn't going to outrun them, but maybe she could outsmart them. Her fingers danced across the control panel, her eyes never leaving the dark outline of the enemy ship. The warship's sensors were locking onto her pod, no doubt preparing to disable it, to pull her back into the clutches of the people who had sold her. But there was a chance, just a slim chance, that she could turn the tables. She activated the ship's cloaking feature. The pod wasn't fully invisible, but it could scramble the enemy's tracking systems. She held her breath as the pod flickered and shimmered, the lights dimming. For a moment, everything went quiet. The readings on the screen were all over the place, a jumble of numbers and interference. Time seemed to stretch on as she drifted, waiting for the hostile ship to react. The ship's sensors were undoubtedly struggling to pinpoint her exact location. She couldn't tell if it had worked, if she had managed to throw them off. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for the first time in hours she allowed herself a glimmer of hope. But as the seconds ticked by, that hope quickly turned into dread. The screen flickered again, and this time, the message was clearer. The enemy ship had locked onto her once more. They were getting closer. She couldn't keep this up forever. The pod was already taking a beating from the constant jamming and evasive maneuvers. She had no more tricks left, no more plans. The hostile ship would catch her, and she would be dragged back to the people who had sold her. It was a cruel, twisted cycle, and it was almost at its end. Just as she began to prepare herself for the worst, an unexpected transmission broke through the noise. A familiar voice crackled over the radio, distorted and urgent. "Hold on. I'm coming." Her heart skipped a beat. She recognized the voice. It was him, the man who had saved her. His voice was strained, desperate, but there was no mistaking it. He was alive. He was still out there, still fighting. The transmission cut out almost immediately, leaving her in stunned silence. Had he really come for her? Was he still alive? The reality of what that meant crashed over her, filling her with a new surge of determination. He wasn't giving up on her. He had kept his promise. And now, she had to keep hers. With the enemy ship bearing down on her, she made a decision. She wasn't going to run anymore. She wasn't going to hide. She would fight. For him. For herself. For the life she had just begun to grasp. Taking a deep breath, she locked her eyes on the flashing lights of the hostile ship. There was no turning back now. The pod wasn't just a way out, it was her weapon. She had been trained for this. She had been a pawn in someone else's game, but no longer. She had control of her destiny now, and she wasn't going to let it slip through her fingers. With renewed purpose, she reprogrammed the pod's systems to override its cloaking device. She turned toward the enemy ship, her fingers moving rapidly across the controls as she prepared to engage the pod's offensive capabilities. It wasn't much, a few low-powered weapons, a couple of emergency thrusters, but it was enough. She had nothing left to lose. The hostile ship came closer, its weapons powered up and ready to strike. But she wasn't going to wait for them to make the first move. She fired the pod's thrusters at full force, rocketing herself toward the warship with reckless abandon. The ship's weapons locked on, but it was too late. She was already closing in. The first shot from the warship missed. The second didn't. The impact rocked the pod, the console flashing red as alarms screamed in her ears. Her body slammed into the seat, the pain almost blinding, but she didn't stop. She fired again, this time connecting with one of the enemy ship's weaker points and external comms array. The explosion sent shockwaves through the enemy ship, knocking out their targeting systems for a moment. It was just enough. The hostile vessel was momentarily disabled, its weapons malfunctioning as their systems scrambled to regain control. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the escape pod's emergency thrusters again, pushing herself into the heart of the chaos. She was doing it, she was surviving. And just as she thought it was all over, just as the ship's cannon systems came back online and a massive blast lit up the void, a second, much larger explosion rocked the hostile ship. The transmission crackled again, this time clearer than ever before. "Get out of here." Now. It was him. The man was alive, and somehow, he had managed to disable the hostile ship with an attack of his own. The enemy vessel was breaking apart, drifting slowly into the blackness of space. She could hardly believe it. Against all odds, they had done it. Her heart pounded as the escape pod systems came online again, the damaged readings stabilizing. The fire from the warship had been enough to break their pursuers' hold, but it wasn't over. She wasn't out of danger yet. She glanced one last time at the wreckage of the hostile ship, its massive form now little more than a decaying shell. She pushed the throttle forward, her pod shooting off toward the stars. The man had kept his promise. He had come for her, and together, they had made it. They were free. But that freedom came at a price, and she knew the war was far from over. As the pod accelerated away from the wreckage, she closed her eyes for a moment, letting herself feel the weight of everything that had happened. She had been a pawn. She had been a victim. But now, she was something more. She was a survivor. And as the stars stretched out before her, she knew that whatever came next, she wasn't going to face it alone.